Hi, I'm Stephen. This is my English 202 Unit 1 project. I chose to do my topic on Ambrose Bierce. So let's go ahead and get started. Ambrose Bierce was originally born in Ohio, but he grew up mostly in Indiana, where he received a small education. He would go on to become a printer's apprentice in Indiana, and when the Civil War began, he joined an infantry unit there. He actually fought in a number of different battles during the Civil War. Some of which were pretty famous. He also fought in Chickamauga, which he also wrote about. And after the war, he moved to San Francisco, where he began writing. He wrote and became an editor for a newspaper, and wrote very many short stories. He became known for realism shown in his writings. And in 1913, he traveled to Mexico to assist in the revolution led by Pancho Villa, but would never return. It's still unsure how exactly he died. It's still a mystery to this day. Obviously, it's suspected he died in the revolution. He mostly wrote short stories about the war, but he did write some ghost stories as well. And he wrote some poetry and verse. Um, but most notably, he wrote over 200 short stories, which can be found in a 12-volume set called The Complete Short Stories of Ambrose Bierce. And some of his most famous works include the following: An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, The Devil's Dictionary, A Horseman in the Sky, Chickamauga, and Killed at Resaca. Bierce lived in the Civil War era, and as previously said, he fought in a lot of battles. So he wrote a lot of war stories that outshined others of his era due to his first-hand experience. In his short story Chickamauga, the story is actually told from the view of a child. The reason this was so brilliant was because most war stories, almost all of them exclusively, are told from the perspective of the soldiers. And the Civil War was devastating because it was fought here, between family members and friends, like in our homes, with our neighbors. So the child, seeing men crawling and jumping on their backs, trying to play, like not understanding what was going on, only for him to like realize the horrors of everything going on around him, was just such a great depiction of what it would be like for the public to experience war for the first time. Obviously, he was very famous for his realism. In An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, for example, um, we have our protagonist, Peyton Farquhar, who is basically in this escape fantasy where he's escaping from being hung, and he's lulling the reader in this false sense of security the whole story, but dropping small hints that none of this fantasy world is real, which he very abruptly and quickly just pulls you back to reality, as he just kills Farquhar almost nonchalantly at the end. Um, but his ability to write in such a way that deceives the reader as to whether or not like the events are real or not is just outstanding. The details of the soldiers on the bridge, the vivid descriptions of the events and colors and everything else that are happening. The gray-eyed soldier who fired at him, but Farquhar had just previously talked about how his father had told him like marksmen with gray eyes never miss. They're all like entrapping the reader almost, into this. Oh my gosh, this story is so great. But there are small hints, like the gray-eyed soldier missing, that it was none of it was real. Bierce, whether intentionally or not, actually used a lot of regionalism in his stories as well. Many of his stories center around the Civil War, obviously, so like a lot of his stories took place in the South. So naturally, there was a lot of regionalism in his stories. The South has a very rich culture, very rich dialect, very distinct. There's a very interesting exchange between Peyton Farquhar and a soldier who turns out to be a Northern spy, talking on his estate, and it even says that his Southern estate is described in quite a bit of detail as patriotism, that Farquhar feels for the South. Um, and even more so, there's like a brief exchange between Farquhar and the soldier, And the dialect that's used is very southern in nature, and they even use expressions like the dry wood would burn like towel, which is a very southern expression that if you're not from the area, you might not understand. Naturalism is actually very similar to realism. Both tend to be more based on reality. Um, but the main difference is like naturalism focuses usually more on the effects of nature itself. But because of the similarities, Bierce wrote stories with a lot of naturalistic elements. I think a good example of this is Chickamauga. We spoke about how it was from the perspective of a child. I actually think that the child's came to see war almost as like a force of nature, even if that's not like how he understood it. But excuse me, uh, like he lost everything. Like he thought it was all a game, was crawling around, only to become horrified by these men and like the his surroundings. And when he tried to get back home, like his home was burning and his mother had passed away, and he his life had basically just been flipped upside down in a moment by this force of nature that is war. And I think it was supposed to be had a lot of naturalistic elements to it. Because he wrote about so many war stories, um, moral ambiguity is a pretty common theme in a lot of Bierce's stories. In war, a lot of things are just everything's gray. Everything is a gray area. A lot of things that would normally be immoral are justified. Things that normally are justified become immoral. Things that just get flipped upside down and backwards. For example, in Chickamauga with the child and how his home was burned and his mother had been killed in the front yard and everything. Normally, obviously, that would be like a horrible, horrendous act. But like in war, that's just whatever. It's just another casualty. Uh, I mean, in the Civil War, like part of the reason it won was because of Sherman's march. They literally marched through the South and they just burned the South to the ground. Everything, crops, homes, civilians were affected. Uh, as long as it's to win, you can justify it in the end. Nobody really cares anymore. Nobody blinks an eye. Um, and that's just so. There's a lot of moral ambiguity in Bierce's stories. Bierce is actually compared pretty often to Edgar Allan Poe and Jonathan Swift, which I completely understand. Um, but I really like that Howard Barr states that it's a patent misrepresentation to generalize by putting him arbitrarily into any one category. Because Bierce actually wrote so many different stories and different types and different genres, and so many different styles that like he was known for his realism, but he wrote so much more. They should be recognized for far more. It's just he's not as famous for it. So I don't think it's fair to just like say, oh, Bierce is like Edgar Allan Poe, or he's just another Jonathan Swift, because he could be both or more. Um, so kind of sticking with that theme, Bierce is because Bierce is so famous for his realism and how gruesome a lot of his stories are. A lot of critics actually saw that as like the only way to interpret his writings. So I feel like for a long time, Bierce was almost maybe a little misunderstood. Um, and Lawrence Burkove actually wrote that as long as critics think this way, they do not pay close enough attention to the way Bierce's stories are constructed, and many do not even suspect that there's intellectual and depth to his fiction, which I really like. I think part of the reason his stories are so gruesome is because Bierce was writing a lot from his own experience. He fought in the war. Um, so there's a lot more to his stories than just um, some dude being a pessimist and writing horrible, gruesome stories. And while Bierce is famous for his short stories, he actually wrote for a newspaper. Which I mentioned towards the beginning, he became an editor when he moved to San Francisco. And a topic I actually didn't know this, but a topic that intrigued Bierce a good bit was actually utopian society. And Burkove sums this up pretty well. Utopian thought touched Bierce deeply. He regarded it as a paradigm of American principles and practices, which is a pretty interesting interesting thought that Bierce was so like enraptured by um, utopian society because he was in the war. So obviously something like that, like peace, would be very like very tempting for him. Would really draw him in, which is part of the reason he moved to California. Um, there's a lot of utopian projects that happen out there that he actually like kept up with. So obviously Bierce was very good at writing horror stories. And Kalina Maleska actually believed that it was because he had such a profound understanding of fear. She said, as a writer, who had an in-depth understanding of the phenomenon of fear and who represents it in a very realistic manner without the use of supernatural elements, which is one of the crucial characteristics of a horror genre. Which I think was just such an interesting take. As someone who was on the front lines in a war and part of the infantry, and especially a war like the Civil War, which was much more gruesome and involved than a lot of the wars that are fought today. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he would have such an in-depth understanding of fear. Um, but I thought that was a very interesting take on him. So my opinion on Bierce, I actually really enjoyed his works quite a bit, even though I haven't read too many of them. Obviously, I haven't read all 200 of his short stories. But I love the realistic and grounded approach he takes. And I think he has such a unique way of blending fantasy and reality to honestly just to reveal how cruel reality can actually be sometimes. I think part of the reason I'm drawn to his stories is like he has such an interesting view of the Civil War and the reality of it. And as previously serving in the military as a medic, it's something that I'm at least somewhat familiar with. Although my experiences are not even remotely close to as graphic as a lot of the things Bierce writes about, thankfully. In addition, I also think I intend to be a little more grounded in reality, even if I am a bit pessimistic at times. Um, Part of me just thinks that's because reality just a lot of times it is cruel, but it is what it is. And at the same time, like we're responsible for a lot of the outcomes. Something that Beer seemed to believe as well, especially with Peyton Farquhar's fate literally being as a result of his own actions. He wanted to be a hero and got himself killed. And that'll conclude my presentation. And this is my bibliography. Hope you enjoyed it.